March 1943. The Bismarck Sea. A Japanese convoy steamed toward New Guinea, packed with troops and supplies meant to reinforce a crumbling front. 8,000 soldiers below deck, 16 ships in formation, and the promise of survival, if they could just reach land. But they never made it, because above those waves, a new tactic was about to be unleashed, one that would turn the ocean into a killing field, and the B-25 Mitchell bomber into the most terrifying ship killer in the Pacific. This is the story of the Battle of the Bismarck Sea, and how American ingenuity transformed a medium bomber into a weapon of devastating precision. The problem: distance and desperation. By early 1943, the war in the Pacific had become a brutal contest of supply lines and reinforcement. Japan had swept through Asia with terrifying speed, but now, stretched thin across thousands of miles of ocean, they faced a new reality. Every soldier, every bullet, every sack of rice had to cross open water to reach the front, and the Americans knew it. New Guinea had become a focal point, a massive island covered in jungle and mountains, sitting like a dagger pointed at Australia. If Japan controlled it, the entire southern Pacific would be vulnerable. If the Allies held it, Japan's expansion would stall. But holding ground required men, and moving men required ships. For the Japanese, the math was grim. Their bases in Rabaul, perched on the northern tip of New Britain, were well fortified and supplied. But Lae, on the northern coast of New Guinea, was starving. The garrison there was running out of everything: ammunition, food, medical supplies, hope. A decision was made. A convoy would be assembled. Troop transports, destroyers, and cruisers would sail under cover of weather and darkness, racing across the Bismarck Sea to deliver reinforcements. 8,000 soldiers of the 51st Division boarded the transports, veterans, many of them, men who had fought in China, who had survived jungle warfare and knew what was waiting for them on the other side. But they also knew the danger. American aircraft prowled the skies. Submarines lurked beneath the waves. The convoy would need speed, luck, and the weather on its side. What they didn't know was that the Americans were watching, and more importantly, they were ready. For months, Allied commanders had wrestled with a problem of their own. They could see Japanese convoys. They could track them. But sinking them was another matter entirely. Traditional level bombing, flying high and dropping bombs straight down, was almost useless against moving ships. The bombs took too long to fall, the ships too nimble to predict. Crews would watch their payloads splash harmlessly into the sea, time after time, frustration mounting with every wasted sortie. Torpedoes worked, but only if you had torpedo bombers, and those were in short supply in the Pacific. The few that existed were fragile, slow, and required skilled crews to get close enough to launch. Against well-defended convoys bristling with anti-aircraft guns, it was a suicide mission more often than not. The Allies needed something different, a way to strike ships with precision, at low altitude, with firepower that could shred steel and wood alike. The answer came from an unlikely source, not from a new weapon, but from a new way of thinking, and it would turn the B-25 Mitchell, a medium bomber designed for land targets, into the scourge of the Pacific seas. The weapon: birth of the Strafer. The North American B-25 Mitchell was never supposed to hunt ships. It was a twin-engine medium bomber built for versatility, designed to strike airfields, supply depots, and infrastructure deep behind enemy lines. Solid, dependable, rugged enough to take punishment and keep flying. But in the hands of Major Paul Pappy Gunn and General George Kenney, it became something else entirely. Gunn was a mechanic and pilot with a reputation for improvisation. Before the war, he'd been a bush pilot in the Philippines. When Japan invaded, he barely escaped with his life. But his wife and children were captured and interned. That loss fueled him. He didn't just want to fight the Japanese. He wanted to obliterate them. Kenney, commander of Allied air forces in the Southwest Pacific, was a pragmatist. He didn't care about doctrine or tradition. He cared about results. When his crews reported that high-altitude bombing was failing against ships, he told them to figure out a solution. Gunn had an idea, a radical one. What if they stripped out the bombardier position in the nose of the B-25, removed the plexiglass, and packed it full of forward-firing machine guns? What if, instead of dropping bombs from altitude, they flew in low, masthead height, just above the waves, and raked the enemy ships with gunfire before releasing their payload at point-blank range? It sounded insane. Flying that low meant exposure to every gun on the convoy. One mistake, one burst of flak, and the bomber would cartwheel into the sea, but Gunn believed it would work, and Kenney gave him permission to try. The modifications began. B-25s rolled into makeshift workshops in Australia and New Guinea. Their noses were gutted and rebuilt. 4.50 caliber Browning machine guns were installed in the nose, aimed straight ahead. Some variants carried 6, others 8. The bombardier's station was gone. In its place, a torrent of firepower converging on a single point. Pilots trained in the new tactic, called skip bombing. They would roar in at wave-top level, guns blazing, shredding the superstructure and deck crews of enemy ships. Then, at the last possible moment, they would release their bombs, not from thousands of feet up, but from mere yards above the water. The bombs would skip across the surface like stones on a pond, slamming into the hull below the waterline where armor was thinnest. If the fuse was set right, the bomb would detonate inside the ship, ripping it apart from within. It was brutal, it was precise, and in trials, it worked. By early 1943, several B-25 squadrons had been converted into Strafers. The Mitchell, once a workhorse, had become a predator. The Japanese had no idea what was coming. The Convoy, 16 ships, one gamble. On February 28, 1943, the Convoy departed Rabaul. 16 vessels in total. 8 troop transports, crammed with soldiers and supplies. 8 destroyers, bristling with anti-aircraft guns, ready to defend the flotilla. The plan was simple. Sail under cover of bad weather, hug the northern coast of New Britain, then dash across the Bismarck Sea to Lae under the protection of Japanese fighters from nearby air bases. The weather cooperated at first. Heavy clouds and squalls blanketed the sea, hiding the convoy from Allied reconnaissance planes. The Japanese commanders allowed themselves a measure of hope. Perhaps this run would be different. Perhaps they would make it through. But the weather wouldn't last forever. On March 1st, an American B-24 Liberator, flying a routine patrol, spotted the convoy through a break in the clouds. The pilot radioed back the position. The Allies now knew exactly where the Japanese were and where they were heading. General Kenney's headquarters erupted into action. Every available aircraft was scrambled. B-17 Flying Fortresses, B-25 Mitchells, A-20 Havocs, Australian Beaufighters, even P-38 Lightnings to provide top cover and strafe any fighters that tried to intervene. The first strikes came on March 2nd. High-altitude B-17s attempted level bombing runs. As expected, they achieved little. A few near misses, some damage to a destroyer. But the convoy pressed on. The Japanese crews grew confident. They had weathered the storm. Soon, they would be within range of land-based air cover. Soon, they would reach Leh. They had no idea that the real attack hadn't even begun. The slaughter, Masthead Height. March 3rd, 1943. Dawn. The weather had cleared. The sea was calm. And from the south, the roar of engines grew louder. 13 B-25 Strafers came in low. So low their propellers churned sea spray. So low the Japanese gunners had only seconds to react. And then the sky erupted. The Mitchells opened fire. Dozens of 50 caliber guns converged on the lead transport. Tracers ripped through the bridge, tearing apart officers, radios, and steering equipment. Deck crews were cut down before they could man their weapons. Wood splintered, metal sheared. Chaos consumed the ship. At the last possible second, the B-25s released their bombs. They skipped across the water, once, twice, and slammed into the hull below the waterline. Explosions tore through the engine rooms and cargo holds. Men screamed. The ship listed, then began to sink. And the Mitchells weren't done. They circled back, strafing again, pouring fire into lifeboats and survivors in the water. There was no mercy here, no quarter given. The mission was total destruction. One by one, the transports were hit. The second ship exploded, its munitions igniting in a fireball that could be seen for miles. The third took 3 bombs amidships and broke in half. The fourth, trying desperately to evade, ran straight into another Mitchell's line of fire and was shredded stem to stern. The destroyers fought back. Anti-aircraft fire filled the sky. Shells burst around the American bombers. One B-25 took a direct hit and plunged into the sea. Its crew lost instantly. Another limped away trailing smoke, barely making it back to base. But the carnage continued. Australian Beaufighters joined the assault, their cannons raking the decks of destroyers. 20 Havocs screamed in, adding their bombs to the inferno. P-38. Lightnings dove from above, intercepting Japanese Zero fighters scrambling from Rabaul, keeping them away from the bombers. For hours, the battle raged. The sea turned black with oil and red with blood. Ships burned, capsized, exploded. Men leapt into the water, only to be strafed as they swam. Lifeboats were riddled with bullets. The ocean became a graveyard. By the end of the day, all 8 transports were sunk or sinking. 4 destroyers were destroyed. The remaining 4, battered and burning, limped back toward Rabaul. And below the waves, 8,000 Japanese soldiers would never set foot on New Guinea. The aftermath, a turning point. The Battle of the Bismarck Sea was over in 3 days, but its impact would echo for the rest of the war. For Japan, it was a catastrophe. Not just the loss of men, though that alone was staggering, but the loss of confidence. The convoy route to Leh was now impassable. Reinforcement by sea, once a calculated risk, was now a death sentence. Japanese commanders were forced to rethink their entire strategy. They could no longer move large formations of troops by surface ship. Instead, they turned to submarines and fast destroyer runs under cover of night, slower, less efficient, and never enough. The 51st Division, shattered before it ever reached the front, would never recover. Leh, starving and unsupported, would fall to the Allies later that year. For the Americans, the victory was proof of concept. The Strafer tactic worked. The B-25 Mitchell, once a conventional bomber, had become a ship killer of devastating effectiveness. General Kenny wasted no time. More B-25s were converted. More crews were trained in skip bombing. The tactic spread across the Pacific, used against convoys, barges, and coastal shipping. The Japanese never adapted. Their ships remained vulnerable, their defenses inadequate, and the Mitchells continued to hunt. The human cost. Statistics tell one story, but the men who lived through it told another. For the Japanese soldiers crammed below deck, the attack was a nightmare. The first explosions came without warning. Darkness, fire, water pouring in from ruptured hulls, men scrambling for exits that no longer existed. Survivors who made it into the water faced strafing runs. Some clung to wreckage for days, hoping for rescue that never came. Others drowned, exhausted, dragged under by the weight of their gear. Of the 8,000 men who boarded the convoy, fewer than 3,000 survived, and many of those were wounded, scattered, or captured. One Japanese officer, rescued by a submarine days later, described it simply, "We were helpless. The bombs came from nowhere. The guns never stopped. It was not battle, it was extermination." For the American and Australian aircrews, the mission was equally harrowing. Flying at masthead height meant no room for error. Flak, debris, and even the masts of sinking ships became deadly hazards. One pilot recalled nearly clipping a destroyer's smokestack as he pulled up from a strafing run. But there was also pride. They had struck a decisive blow. They had stopped an invasion. And they had proven that American innovation could turn the tide of war. The Strafer crews returned to base, exhausted, knowing they had participated in one of the most one-sided victories in naval history. Legacy of the Strafer. The B-25 Mitchell would go on to serve in every theatre of World War II, but its legend was forged in the Pacific. After the Bismarck Sea, it became the primary weapon against Japanese shipping. Convoys, barges, and coastal transports fell victim to its guns and skip bombs. The tactic was so effective that Japan was forced to abandon daylight shipping routes entirely. The Mitchell's versatility was unmatched. It could strafe, it could bomb, it could carry torpedoes, rockets, or even a 75mm cannon in its nose. It was flown by American, British, Australian, and Soviet crews. It served in every climate, from the frozen Aleutians to the steaming jungles of Burma. But its most enduring legacy was psychological. The Japanese learned to fear the sight of a B-25 coming in low. Its silhouette became synonymous with destruction. For the Allies, it symbolized adaptability. When high-altitude bombing failed, they didn't give up. They innovated. When convoys couldn't be stopped with torpedoes, they found another way. The B-25 wasn't the fastest bomber. It wasn't the most heavily armed. But it was the one that could be adapted, modified, and unleashed in ways no one had imagined. And in the Battle of the Bismarck Sea, that adaptability decided the fate of 8,000 men. Reflection, the lesson of the Mitchell. The story of the B-25 Mitchell and the Battle of the Bismarck Sea is not just about machines or tactics. It's about necessity, about the willingness to abandon convention when convention fails. The skip-bombing Strafer was born from desperation, refined through trial, and perfected in combat. It wasn't elegant, it wasn't pretty, but it worked. And that's the lesson. Wars are won not by those with the best equipment, but by those willing to use what they have in the smartest way possible. The B-25 was a medium bomber, but in the hands of innovative commanders and courageous crews, it became a weapon that changed the course of the Pacific War. 8,000 Japanese soldiers never made it to shore. The B-25 made sure of it. The B-25 Mitchell was more than a bomber. It was proof that innovation wins wars. But the Pacific was filled with other battles, other machines, and other moments where everything hung in the balance. If you want to keep exploring the stories of the aircraft that shaped history, make sure you subscribe. And let us know in the comments, which warbird story should we tell next? Because every mission has a story, and every story has a lesson.